All right. Well, thanks for joining us for our bonus presentation here for session 5 of the Adaptation Planning and Practices for Forest Carbon Management online course. This is a presentation that we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into menus and in particular discuss some of the practices, the strategies and approaches, and relate those to specific practices or tactics for the forest carbon management menu, as well as kind of connect these to some of those important concepts for carbon management that hopefully you'll all be thinking about as you start to think about what are the actions that you can take and how do those actions support carbon and then fit additionally with other goals, as well as thinking about your climate risks and vulnerability and how to reduce those risks through adaptation. All right, so the agenda kind of just says the same thing that I just said here, but we're going to start off by having a little bit of a look at the menus again, a little bit of a recap on what menus are, a little bit of the discussion on how they're created to give you a little bit more context for kind of the scientific underpinnings for these menus. We'll talk a little bit about some of these concepts for carbon management. And then start to then relate that to on-the-ground actions. So starting with a look at some common forestry practices and understanding what are the carbon implications for those common practices, and then dive into some examples of regional carbon management practices that are appropriate for the eastern forest types in both the Northeast and the Lake States and kind of Midwest in general, kind of relating those to the strategies and approaches in the forest carbon management menu. All right, so we've already kind of introduced the idea of these menus, and so just kind of as a recap, what is an adaptation menu? It's really a list of all the possible actions that you could implement that kind of allows you to brainstorm ideas on and help you to decide what's most relevant for your particular location, your site conditions, your goals that you're trying to achieve in your management. So it's really that whole kind of everything that you could be thinking about in this sort of tiered approach, really to help you kind of identify what you could be implementing. So we've already been thinking a little bit about these adaptation options that were described in the lecture previously of resistance and resilience and transition, right? So these are different ways that we could be kind of thinking about how to be adapting our sites to climate impacts or to reduce the risks from climate impacts. And then underneath these concepts, then the menus identify both strategies and approaches, where strategies are kind of these bigger picture ideas. They could align to kind of more regionally specific conditions or just kind of a broader set of ideas to help kind of achieve goals. In this case, with carbon management goals towards enhancing carbon benefits. Within each strategy are multiple approaches that are more specific descriptions of that strategy. So more specific actions that could be taken that maybe relate to a particular forest type or ecosystem or maybe more relevant for a certain set of conditions. And so that's where the menus end, are at that level of that approach. And then as the user of the menu, as you're going through the workbook, then you'll have to identify the tactics, the actual kind of on the ground management, sort of how are you going to implement that approach. And so you could think of these as, silvicultural prescriptions or other very specific descriptions of how to implement that particular approach. And in doing this, kind of following this tiered approach, you can see how the linkage between the tactic to the approach and the approach to the strategy, that really that kind of helps you kind of draw that line of logic between what you're doing on the ground and sort of how it's lines up with strategies and approaches, and ultimately to those adaptation options. Is this an action that's helping you to resist climate change, to enhance resilience? Is it an action that's helping you to kind of transition to a more future adapted forest? So that's kind of a way to really kind of understand what we say when we say that the menus are organized sort of hierarchically or in this tiered approach. The way that we develop menus is kind of a process that really begins with kind of a recognition of a need for a menu. We typically have heard from the folks that we work with through courses like this one, through our in-person workshops. People say, gosh, it would be really great if we had a menu for this thing, and that's really how the forest carbon management menu started as well. We worked with folks who were saying, we're interested in adaptation, but I'm really interested in thinking about carbon and how can I manage for carbon, and there isn't that isn't really made explicit in some of the existing menus. So we had this interest from the users of the workbook, and then typically we partner with other organizations who can add capacity to our team, and have expertise in that particular topic. So one of the other courses that has been kind of running in parallel a little bit ahead of this course is the wildlife management course. And that's a good example of how NIAX has partnered with additional agencies and other organizations to really bring some additional expertise to thinking about adaptation from the perspective of wildlife. And for the forest carbon management menu, we worked closely, in particular, with our partners at American Forests, who have been doing a lot of work thinking about and working with various organizations and agencies on carbon management. Oftentimes we will do a lot of working kind of hands-on with practitioners, with other researchers, folks who have sort of that topical expertise to really inform, make sure that we're not missing anything, kind of point us in the right direction. But the one thing that all menus really have a strong emphasis is on that literature review piece. So really looking at the published literature, peer-reviewed papers, white papers, reports, GTRs, anything that's out there that really kind of has looked into this, and we can kind of draw on sort of regional or kind of context-specific information on that topic. And so for the forest carbon management menu, that was a literature review of a little over 200 scientific papers that had been published, and also, as I mentioned, other reports and white papers and those sorts of things, but all published in the last about 10 to 15 years. And then we kind of take all this information that we've gleaned from talking with researchers and foresters and reviewing the literature, and then kind of framing these strategies and approaches to come up with essentially a draft menu. And then we go Yeah, so then we have the whole testing phase. So we kind of create something to work with, but then we understand that it needs to be tested, it needs to be refined, and then it needs to be published. It needs to undergo that kind of final testing phase of peer review to before we kind of put it out there and call it a sort of a product that's ready for use by practitioners. And then, of course, then there's continued through use. There's kind of continued eye towards improvement, and we actually have with our forestry menu, which was our first menu, have undergone an additional sort of version 2 refinement as well. And so, kind of as our scientific understanding changes and is refined, we want to be incorporating those improvements into our menus as well. Most of them are new enough that we haven't gone through that. So the forest carbon menu or forest carbon management menu, however you want to call it, has kind of gone through this whole process. It was published in the Journal of Forestry in the January 2020 issue, as you can see there at the bottom. And this figure just kind of shows how that menu kind of both speaks to the adaptation piece as well as the mitigation piece, and really how those ideas can align very nicely. And so, thinking along those adaptation options of resistance, resilience, and transition, this figure just kind of shows how those 7 strategies that I've kind of summarized on the left, kind of how resistance can protect carbon stocks. So you can be, aligning or synergizing those approaches, and how building resilience can both have some protection of carbon stocks, but also enhancement of sequestration or carbon uptake. And then additionally, how transition and guiding transition can have, carbon benefits through largely the sequestration piece, but also through enhancing carbon uptake through existing, characteristics of the forest as well. Okay, so that's kind of the intro to the menus and to the forest carbon management menu in particular. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to now kind of think about, all right, so we're really thinking about carbon management here with this particular menu and with a lot of the work that we're doing in our individual projects here in the course. And so I think it's always important to just kind of put that in the context of sort of what are these concepts of carbon management that are really key to both adaptation, thinking about adaptation, but then how we can get these carbon benefits through adaptation. And so really the bottom line when it comes down to is that it's really about thinking about the carbon balance of the ecosystem, right? And in the end, kind of we're looking for, oh, we got sorry, I have a word that got left off there. What matters is the net gain of carbon to the system over a period of time, I think is what got left off there. Whatever that period of time that's relevant for the management and your project is, whether that's, 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years, but thinking about that period of time and, how does the management that we're doing affect carbon inputs to the system, but also reducing the carbon losses to the system. And we'll kind of delve into these bullet points here that relate to both kind of increased inputs and reduced losses pretty much for the rest of this presentation. But we can think about, these increasing inputs from a couple of different ways, increasing productivity, kind of through, photosynthesis, as well as increasing, thinking holistically about the carbon dynamics and flow of carbon through the ecosystem. We can also be thinking about, inputs to other specific carbon pools. And then of course, for reducing carbon losses, that's what a lot of the adaptation focus is on, reducing risks. And so those risks kind of represent, in a lot of instances, carbon loss from some kind of disturbance, whether it's wildfire or tree mortality, disturbance related losses of carbon. So when we're thinking about carbon management or forest management to avoid carbon losses, there's a whole host of different impacts that could result in carbon losses from the system. And so, part of that consideration was sort of covered in the other bonus lecture that I gave a few weeks ago that related to climate impacts on carbon. And so I'm just kind of summarizing here a couple of important ways that we could be thinking about reducing carbon losses. And so on the photo on the left is showing widespread tree mortality from the spongy moth, or Lamantria dispar. And so, that represents a carbon loss to the system through tree mortality, as those trees, over the long period of time, as those trees then, maybe start to decompose as they, blow down, that's a loss of carbon to the system. A different way to think about carbon losses, again, kind of over a longer stretch of time, is thinking about, how the habitat is changing, and then the ability to maintain productivity in a system that's dominated by, maybe a species that is kind of having reduced productivity or reduced growth rates just because of higher temperatures or changes in precipitation. And here we're showing the Climate Change Tree Atlas projections of suitable habitat for balsam fir in the region, and just showing under that high emission scenario that suitable habitat area begins to kind of shrink, certainly on some of the southern margins, but even in some of the places in the northern part of its range, the habitat suitability just starts to get lower. So this represent, another way to think about carbon losses through lost productivity. And again, it's not just through those sort of chronic issues that relates to carbon, but it could also be through acute disturbances such as, wildfire is being represented in this red line here, where you've kind of just got a drop in carbon from the system as that carbon goes back up into the atmosphere through burning a biomass. And really the point that I want to emphasize here is that it's important to be thinking about these processes over long periods of time. We might have goals for carbon that relate to kind of short-term, goals for 2030, goals for 2050. They might be related to kind of policy-driven goals, and that's that's important to be working towards meeting those kind of near-term goals, but we also don't want to be doing that at the expense of kind of making continued progress in emissions reductions or in greenhouse gas mitigation over the long period of time, because just because we meet targets for 2030 or 2050 doesn't mean that there's accelerating targets to be able to continue to meet the climate goals and emissions reduction goals. And so we need to be thinking about long periods of time, and that's where adaptation sometimes there's this short-term potential for a short-term loss to be when we implement management that might be transitioning, say, towards more future adapted conditions, there might be a short-term loss in carbon to the system, but over that long period of time, compared to sort of a no action alternative where we have the potential for these long-term carbon losses, adaptation may lead to long-term carbon benefits ultimately. So it's just important to be keeping that kind of long time frame in mind. And as I mentioned before, we're thinking about carbon inputs to the system. It's not just enhancing primary net productivity. Enhancing tree growth rates is certainly the most obvious way to be thinking about increasing carbon inputs to the system. But we recognize that carbon dynamics within forest ecosystems are complex. Carbon flows through ecosystems from kind of the live tree carbon pool into these other carbon pools. And so I think that, having that more holistic perspective of carbon in ecosystems is important when thinking about enhancing inputs. We can, how do we enhance inputs to other carbon pools such as snags and coarse woody debris and soils? These are all kind of add up to being kind of the total ecosystem carbon. And so it's important to be thinking about those as well. And we'll have a number of examples. We'll be spending a bit of time to kind of highlight how we can be thinking about these various carbon inputs to the system through different actions. I'm going to start out with just kind of thinking about what are some of the common practices that we look to in forest management, and recognizing that there's carbon implications for those, and there's certainly carbon benefits for a lot of those common practices. So things that people are comfortable implementing, they're oftentimes utilized for meeting other management goals, but they can have important carbon benefits as well. So when we look to the past, we look to what has been implemented in management of forests in the past, we recognize that carbon objectives weren't often a part of those plans. They were often driven by other ecological, oftentimes economic objectives. And there are strong implications for carbon for all of these things. And I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the actions that had some clear benefits for carbon. There's obviously a lot of negative benefits for carbon from some of these actions as well. So the first thing that I like to start off with is just intermediate treatments, pre-commercial thinning, commercial thinning. These are things that are oftentimes done to improve sort of the growth rates of the remaining trees, to improve the health of the stand, and as such, those actions have carbon benefits. So oftentimes this is done to improve, as I said, to improve the growth of the remaining trees. That is sequestration. And so if you kind of look at some of the studies that have been done looking at thinning treatments, in particular, kind of thinning that emphasizes retaining the larger diameter trees, so thinning from below, can have kind of a net gain relative to a control where sort of no thinning was done, and the system was just kind of left as is over a period of a few decades. That can be a carbon positive practice. It can also be done to kind of tweak the species composition. So selecting species to be retained that are more future adapted, that are more tolerant of drought or higher temperatures, can sort of also improve the long-term storage, because those species are being future adapted. They're more reliable carbon stores in some respects. They're better able to withstand those climate changes that we anticipate. Then it also reduces kind of the drought impacts, because you're reducing the competition, at least in the near term. You're reducing the competition for soil water, for nutrients, reducing competition for light. You're just making it a less stressful environment, and that can have some really important resilience impacts or benefits as well. And a whole host of other benefits that might relate to other non-carbon goals, such as wildlife habitat, or just conditions, aesthetic conditions that some landowners may prefer. BMPs are something that I think a lot of foresters are just very comfortable thinking about. And there's obviously regulations in many states to adhere to BMPs, or if you're in Vermont, AMPs. And there are ways that we can enhance those the implementation of those BMPs to have even better or greater carbon benefits. So some of those things include, temporary stream crossings, if you're doing kind of non-winter harvest, retaining slash to reduce soil impacts or soil compaction, even using things like timber mats to kind of achieve the same benefit of reducing rutting or compaction, reducing soil carbon losses through erosion. So these are things that there's a reason why they're called best management practices, and a lot of those reasons have to do in the end have carbon benefits associated with them. Afforestation and reforestation, something that's I think fairly obvious that we look towards for carbon benefits. Planting is something that isn't as widely practiced historically. We've relied on natural regeneration, but where regeneration failures have occurred, where we might be looking towards sort of redirecting the composition, or maybe we maybe we got adequate regeneration, but not of the species that we were desiring. There's a number of ways that we could think about this. Maybe it was following a disturbance, and in particular, thinking about wildfire and wildfire impacts. Those soil conditions that might result from wildfire in certain places like the West may make regeneration more challenging. And so we might need to think about active planting to kind of reduce that lag time following the disturbance, and kind of kickstart sequestration more quickly, and really to kind of get us on that path, that trajectory of carbon accrual in the ecosystem. And so, planting is expensive. It requires a lot of labor, as well as the cost of the materials. And so really the cost effectiveness is greatest when you have these specific conditions where you really need active intervention to kind of get things moving along in that trajectory. And oftentimes places like old pastures, those sorts of things, that establishment of woody biomass is a very slow process especially pasture grasses can be very competitive. And so we might need to do something like is shown there on the right-hand side with like planting, protecting those trees to really get them a head start. So those are just kind of 3 examples of, kind of a common practice and how we can sort of tweak a common practice to really provide some enhanced benefits for carbon. But you can also kind of see that underlying those enhancements, they're just some obvious benefits that we can look to for implementing those practices. I thought about kind of running through the forest carbon management menu and all the kind of explaining the strategies and approaches, but I thought a better way to approach this sort of introduction to the forest carbon management menu here would be actually to pull out some particular strategies and approaches and describe some of the actual tactics, some of the ways that those strategies and approaches could be implemented, and some considerations for where though they might be most appropriate or effective. So I'm going to kind of spend the next 10 minutes or so kind of walking through some of these examples. So when we think about carbon management, I think one place where people oftentimes start is thinking about things like extended rotations. What are some of the ways that we can increase stocking on places that are already well stocked, or maybe they're understocked, and we want to think about, well, how can we increase the stocking on those stands? Obvious benefits from increasing carbon stocking if it's appropriate. And so, extended rotations is one way to do that. If some harvest activities are going to occur, doing less removal, so increasing retention, those are good ways to increase stocking. Just creating reserves, particularly around places that might be either sensitive, have sensitive soils, like wetlands and riparian areas, typically have buffers. We could kind of enhance those buffers, build a larger reserve than what's required, or kind of look to some of those places that have particularly high carbon density. If they're low vulnerability, those are good options. And so I kind of have those icons on the below, sort of like best suited for, these are just kind of your mileage may vary with this. It's really site dependent, but places where some of these forest types are kind of at the southern extent of their range, those are important considerations to think about, like the vulnerability of that particular stand. So a maple beech birch stand that is sort of at the southern extent of the range might be a little bit more vulnerable, and so that might not be as effective of a carbon management than maple beech birch that's sort of in the northern portion. Another example would be sort of when doing management, managing for some of the existing species or genotypes that occur on your site that exhibit wide moisture tolerant or temperature tolerances. And so ways that you could manage for those existing species are, supplemental planting, to kind of boost the component of the forest of that particular species. If there are particular individual trees or stands that have exhibited kind of resilience to previous droughts or previous impacts, protecting those trees so that they can, spread their genetics when management does occur. Just using silvicultural prescriptions that sort of encourage regeneration of particular species that are drought or flood tolerant. Those are all different ways. And this is something that really, I think, is appropriate for almost any forest type. Promoting species or structural diversity is another one that just has, general benefits for resilience. It's one of those, I think, kind of good forestry practices that we look towards, and so certainly from a carbon perspective, that species and structural diversity has been shown to enhance carbon benefits as well. So just more structurally diverse forests have, are able to kind of pack more carbon into sort of the various kind of vertical structural layers in the forest, for example. And there's a number of ways that we could look towards enhancing diversity. Things like variable density thinning, using gaps, or other ways that we can encourage or create uneven age conditions. Looking towards microsites and sort of planting species that might be adapted to those specific site conditions. I already mentioned thinning and how we can kind of tweak species composition. Well, we can also just maintain the species composition by not discouraging certain species, by removing all of those. And certainly protecting old trees as legacy trees is one way to make sure that we are kind of maintaining that old and older age classes on the site. I already talked a little bit about that post-disturbance recovery. And so here's just a little bit more, some more specific actions that we could do to kind of enhance carbon. So, retaining some of the biological legacies. It could be snags, it could be downed wood, but, when some of the times when these disturbances occur, there's sort of an effort to capture some of the value of the wood and by doing some salvage logging. And so just kind of keeping in mind that, some of that, when that salvage logging does occur, that, there is carbon value as well. And so if there's some material that can be left on site, that can provide some enhanced carbon value, you can kind of balance the carbon benefits with some of the economic benefits as well. Certainly, invasives can be a concern if they're already present, and so just having an eye towards controlling any invasives that look like they might be becoming a problem, particularly for the growth of some of the regeneration, so that you're minimizing that competition. And then, revegetating, amending soils, if it seems like soil conditions are proving to be a challenge for reestablishment of trees as well. Assisted migration is something that people sometimes will be coming up in conversation, bringing up as an opportunity or something to think about. It has a lot of considerations that I think are really important to be thinking about when doing so. And there's some good information that we can point towards on sort of ways to think about assisted migration versus sort of range expansion, to essentially look at, like, are you introducing a species that isn't present and it sort of isn't in your region at all, which would be kind of a true assisted migration scenario, versus something like, we don't have the species on the site, but it does exist in our region. Maybe it's just a county or two away, and so we're kind of just expanding the range. Or maybe, we just don't have a population of that particular tree species on our site, but it's all around us. These are all different ways that you can kind of be introducing a species to your site. And there's a neat tool called the seed lot selection tool that kind of helps sort of guide the sourcing of the planting material, so that you can maybe be thinking about what are the species or genotypes that we can look towards that might be well suited for some of the future conditions that we anticipate on our site. So looking towards more like southerly seed zones, or seed zones that are sort of lower in elevation, that might represent climatic conditions that you anticipate in the future. I've talked a little bit about vulnerability and risk, and using that to kind of help guide some of the decision making around management and carbon management, and in particular, thinking about sort of where are places that have lower vulnerability. Those are places that we could look towards for enhancing stocking, enhancing carbon, promoting the development of old forest conditions, retaining more trees, those sorts of things. Those lower vulnerability sites are places that in particular might be well suited to carrying higher carbon stocks into the future, where the risk of those losses are lower. And so some of these forest types that I'm showing here, it's really dependent upon sort of where you are and what's the vulnerability of your place in that sort of mix of species to potential carbon losses. And places that might have higher vulnerability, those are not places that might be wise to increase carbon. Increasing structural complexity. Again, this relates to some of what I already talked a little bit about with species diversity as well. But here, I just want to emphasize again that sort of transfer of carbon to some of the other carbon pools in the forest, especially when there are kind of legacies of past management, we may not have as much carbon in some of those other pools like snags or down logs. And so there might be some opportunities to enhance kind of the deadwood carbon pools. In particular, if there's some low quality trees that, if say pulpwood markets aren't very good, there's not really a good market in your region. And, is it worth, removing that material for a marginal economic gain? There might be a good justification for instead retaining some of that low quality wood on site, either through something like, chop and drop, or just letting the tree stand and kind of turn into a snag, and enhance kind of wildlife habitat as well as dead wood carbon pool as well. And this is something that really, doesn't matter what forest type you're thinking about. Probably you can I would say maybe with the caveat of forest types that where fuels and wildfire are a concern, which is not as prevalent in kind of the eastern region, but for those who are in sort of the western regions and Colorado and stuff, the buildup of dead wood and fuel certainly is a concern, and that's a place where maybe this kind of approach wouldn't be appropriate. There's a lot of ways to promote disturbance resilient species, using prescribed fire, and there are ways that we can be thinking about how do we kind of shift our burn seasons, just depending upon when's a good time, earlier onset of springs, or thinking about opportunities for doing fall burns, those sorts of things. Creating larger openings to promote shade intolerant species that are more resilient to some of those disturbances, or even doing some planting of some of those in openings. And again, that's something that could be potentially appropriate for a lot of different forest types. Herbivory from deer is a big issue for many of us in the Midwest and Northeast, and so just ways that we can kind of give regeneration a better chance of survival, protecting from deer or moose herbivory using repellent sprays, bud caps, fencing, slash walls. There's a lot of experimentation going into this and kind of thinking about the costs and cost effectiveness of this, and so there's been some good results. Slash walls are something that some private landowners may not really be very interested in because of the aesthetics, but for maybe a state agency or a conservation organization that could see some co-benefits from using that sort of approach could be attractive as well. And then obviously reserves, and something that has been mentioned previously with BMPs and those sorts of things. Conservation easements that restrict or eliminate harvesting, or again, enhancing buffer zones. That is some fairly clear science to support just the benefits of this, particularly in places that have, again, that lower vulnerability. We're not as concerned about forest health issues and carbon losses. So again, suitable for certain forest types. Really, that's just depending upon your site conditions and your level of risk and your tolerance of that risk. And I just wanted to mention here that this idea of forest protection has gotten a lot of attention. There's been a lot of conversation around it. Anytime there is a public presentation on carbon management or forestry and carbon, this idea of proforestation comes up, and there's a lot of very vocal segment of the population who's just really pushing for this idea of elimination of timber harvest, particularly on public lands in our region, with this idea that if we allow forests to remain intact, which is another way of saying just kind of undisturbed, that is the best way to enhance their ability to reach their ecological potential for storing carbon. And so, this comes up just repeatedly, and I think it's just important to just recognize that as part of the conversation. I always kind of say yes, but there's this really strong caveat that I think, again, just relates to a lot of what I've just described about, forest protection is important and can be very effective where it is appropriate, and but that it's not a silver bullet. It's not appropriate everywhere, given the risks of disturbance and forest health issues and carbon losses, and that some folks who are really advocating for proforestation are really the messaging is around this idea that it should be implemented everywhere, and that it's just we just need to stop managing. And I think that that's based on some assumptions that I just don't think that is backed up by the scientific literature, which is one, an assumption of how our old growth forests going to perform in terms of maintaining their ability to be carbon sinks as climate is changing. That's a untested and unverified idea, as we know that climate is changing and disturbances frequencies are changing and stressors on trees are changing. But also the second assumption that forests, just leaving forests alone, are going to attain those old growth characteristics, is also an assumption that doesn't really recognize all of these things that I've kind of talked about before, which is that a lot of our forests, are kind of recovering from agriculture, and the abandonment of agriculture. And so, they're oftentimes more homogeneous, even aged conditions, lower species diversity, simplified structure. And that kind of comes with an inherent increase in risk. And so, active intervention in those scenarios can lower risks. And again, maybe create some short-term losses of carbon, but for the longer-term gain. And so I think that's just an important point to recognize and to communicate when these discussions happen. Just recognizing the carbon value both of young and old forests, that young forests are sequestering carbon at very fast rates relative to older forests, which are storing more carbon. And so really the bottom line in that sense is that I think a lot of us recognize sort of that triad approach to forestry provides the greatest benefit over kind of these landscape scales where you can have conservation values in protected forests. You can have kind of a balance of values in timber and conservation. And then you can have some areas that are really timber focused, to meet the needs for fiber and fuel. And by having all three, that we can really kind of balance all of the benefits, including carbon. And it looks like I am short on time, so I'm going to quickly go through this last set of slides here, which is just one more example of a carbon management project that we developed using the Forest Carbon Management Menu. And this one is at the Split Rock Lighthouse State Park in Minnesota. And so it was in partnership with the Minnesota DNR as well as the Nature Conservancy. And this was a park that very beautiful place on the north shore of Lake Superior, but where the aspen and birch forests are kind of falling apart. They established following logging and then fire, and then just through sort of the age of the forest as well as a number of insect pests have really kind of resulted in a lack of regeneration and kind of a transition of the forest to more of a grass and brushy type of ecosystem. And so the park was really interested in thinking about reforestation, both for carbon as well as aesthetics and kind of stabilizing the soils. And so the impacts were really just related to those stressors of deer herbivory, pests and pathogens. They were concerned about drought because these are really thin soils, and kind of extreme storms that potentially could cause some problems for erosion. And they had two different sites that they were really thinking about reforestation. One was a natural area where they really didn't have a lot of park infrastructure. That's shown on that site B. And then site A is an area where there's trails, there's buildings, there's campgrounds. So there are some different regulations that kind of impacted how they could be thinking about reforestation at this site. And so I'm, in the interest of time here, just to kind of stick to our allotment of time, there were a number of things that they had already planned on doing, and I'm showing here the approach from the Forest Carbon Management Menu and then the tactic that they used. And so a lot of those things that they had planned on doing continued to make sense. They had adaptation value, they had carbon value, and not surprisingly, a lot of them they planned on continuing to do. Things like protecting those seedlings from deer herbivory, since it was an obvious issue at the site. They looked at they recognized that there were some adjustments that they could make. And in particular, they wanted to be planting a lot of conifer species because that was what was historically on the site. That's sort of what the forests in the region have, a strong conifer component. But they recognized that the conifers were not necessarily expected to do well into the future. And so they kind of tweaked how they wanted to implement that by really focusing on those lower vulnerability microsites, some of the north-facing slopes, some of the lower draws that where cold air kind of pools. They recognized those were the areas that probably were the best bet for reestablishing the conifers. And then they identified a bunch of new stuff using the menu. And that really, I think, relates to both, introducing some southern adapted species or genotypes. And in particular, the more natural area, they were kind of restricted on their ability to introduce new things. But for that site A, where there was a lot of infrastructure and trails, they had more ability to, because it was more of a visitor use area. They had the ability to plant things like bur oak and other things that aren't found in their region. They're found further to the south. And in that more natural area, they had to more focus on kind of future adapted species that are already there. And then the last thing to point out is they hadn't been thinking about kind of the retention aspects, but they recognize there's carbon value in that retention as well. And so they wanted to emphasize that in their reforestation plans. All right, so with less than 1 minute to spare, that's the last slide here, and I guess we'll just kind of pause the recording and then we'll kind of open it up for any questions if folks have time and can stay on.